everybody, welcome back to the Vet Files, where we dig deep into the creatures that crawl through the world of veterinary medicine, and sometimes into our own lives too. Today, we'll be spotlighting 6 parasites that you may not think about often, but you should. From giant tapeworms in baby goats like Moniezia expansa, to microscopic worms that hijack muscles like little viral geniuses, we'll look at how they infect, what they do to their hosts, how we diagnose them, and how they are transmitted. So in my last semester at Auburn, I took parasitology with Dr. Christine Sunderman, who's like an expert parasitologist. Love her, can't rave about her enough. So she taught us so much. We learned over 75 in-depth life cycles, all of that stuff. So all of the information in this episode is directly from my notes, exams, and research that I did in the class. And then I have also provided resources to back up my notes. So let's get into it. First up, we've got Moniezia expansa, which is known as the ruminant tapeworm. And it's exactly what it sounds like. If you've seen a tapeworm, it's essentially, it looks like literally a long piece of Scotch tape. So this specific worm can get up to about 6.5 feet or 2 meters. The adult tapeworms live in the large or small intestine. So when the animal passes the adult, that's kind of how you diagnose it. You diagnose it by what it looks like in the feces. And basically the morphology of any tapeworm is in the very, very front is something called the scolex, which is like the sucker, but it's not actually hooking on and sucking like a leech would. It's more like it's absorbing through the body surface. That's just where it hooks on for manual attachment. And it doesn't really have an opening for taking in food, but right behind that scolex is where new segments are being produced and added to the chain of segments. So the older the segment is, the farther it is from the scolex. So if this is the head and you continue going posteriorly down the body, the more posterior you go, those are the oldest segments. So the neck might be new right now, but in a month from now, it'll be down towards the end. And, it might be 3 feet long, and at that point, it's 3 months old. A mature tapeworm consists of hundreds or thousands of segments. Tapeworms are egg machines, and segments are really nothing but packages of reproductive organs. So if you look at a histological segment and it's kind of sliced in half, there's like a central line, and then on either side of that central line it looks like a huge reed, like circulatory. It looks kind of like veins, but it's really their ovaries with fertilized eggs. And by the time that the segment is released from the worm and passes out into the environment, the segments are seen about a half an inch in width. Each Moniezia segment has 2 sets of ovaries and testes. A tapeworm egg in the environment can only continue developing if eaten by a free-living pasture mite. Normal pasture contains millions of these microscopic free-living mites. Inside the mite, the tapeworm develops over a period of 1 to 4 months into a form that can infect a sheep or goat. Sheep and goats can routinely consume pasture mites while grazing, and when a mite with a fully developed larva is eaten, the tapeworm larva will complete its development to the adult stage in the small ruminant intestine. It takes about 6 weeks for a mature tapeworm to form and start shedding segments containing eggs. Infection is far more common and apparent in lambs and kids than in adult sheep and goats. Animals develop an immune response to tapeworms that may not completely prevent infection, but will limit the number and the size of tapeworms. So the higher the worm burden, the higher the symptoms may affect the animal. And that tends to happen more often in the younger animals because they don't have the same immune response in the immune system, similar to like a baby not being as resistant to the flu or cold or any other sickness that an adult might be more resistant to. Tapeworm infection is usually diagnosed by seeing segments in manure, like I said earlier, but individual tapeworm eggs can also be seen on a routine fecal exam. So if you suspect the animal might have any kind of parasite, you can take a fecal, take it into your veterinarian, and they can use a microscope and see the different kinds of eggs. So in lab, we really worked hard on identifying the eggs in the feces because that is the usual diagnostic routine. And Moniezia expansa is really unique. It's known as one with square-shaped or triangle-shaped eggs because that's what they look like. They're very geometric, very asymmetrical, and it's so interesting to look at. It was one of my favorites that I wanted to highlight out of the few animal parasites that we talked about in the class. So despite its size, it's usually asymptomatic. It's really not a big deal. But when clinical signs do show, they include weight loss, diarrhea, and even intestinal blockages if, again, the worm burden, which means how many worms the animal has, is very high. human risk or zoonotic risk, there is none. This one is strictly for ruminants. Anyway, on to Gretel, and she'll talk about Trichinella spiralis.
Yes, so I have a bit less experience than Michaelin on the subject, but because I have been around vet med so long, I have seen worms come out of plenty of puppies in Belize, and I've treated plenty of dogs with dewormers, and I truly have seen the importance of this. And on another side, when we run into this in wildlife, we automatically want to treat them for these worms, but sometimes it can be beneficial to leave them because they have their own microbiome and relationship with the environment with these microorganisms. So while we can always see them as a bad thing, sometimes for the wildlife, we shouldn't be doing more. But it depends on the case. So in this segment, Trichinella spiralis, what is this? This is called the pork worm, and it has a really odd viral strategy. So it is quite the master of manipulation. Trichinella spiralis is a tiny roundworm that lives in the muscles of its host. It's transmitted through eating raw or undercooked meat, especially pork or wild game. So have to be very careful. How does it work? When the larvae are eaten, they travel from the intestines to the muscles, and this is where the parasite starts to work. It creates what's called a nurse cell, a structure that builds itself by hijacking a muscle cell. It shuts down the cell's normal oxygen metabolism by changing the mitochondria from aerobic to anaerobic and rewires it to support the parasite. This makes it grow new blood vessels, angiogenesis, and even wraps it in collagen for protection. So this is why we call this a virus strategy. Even though it's a worm, it's behaving like a virus and overtaking a host cell. So what are these signs that you might have this? Gastrointestinal issues first on, so think of upset stomach, vomiting, and diarrhea. Also muscle pain, fever, sweating and swelling, and those really odd splinter hemorrhages under the nails. Animals can get this by eating raw meat scraps, so one major rule in farming for pork, never feed the pig meat that's raw. The recommended treatment of trichinellosis is either betamendazole or albendazole. Sorry, not great at pronouncing these. There's also another version called T. nativa, and it's a cold adapted version. So it's found in the Arctic and can survive freezing temperatures. So you cannot bring back polar bear meat or other game from certain regions of Alaska for this reason. Is this absolutely terrifying? Yes. But is it preventable? Yes. Please cook your meat. And also be careful when feeding your pets raw meat. This can be very, very dangerous.
Yeah, this one was very interesting to learn about. I feel like we didn't spend a whole lot of time on it, which was interesting because it's so complex. Trichinella nativa, the one in Antarctica, I think it's got something like a 98% infection rate. And that doesn't necessarily harm the animals there, but when you ingest it and your immune system is not adapted to it, then it can be serious. So when, like Gretel said, when you go hunting in Alaska, you are not allowed legally to bring those animals back and eat them because you'll get trichinosis, sorry. Also, as far as the production animal side of things goes, obviously this is a pig. These are production animals that are providing national resources for food. The reason that we have meat inspection laws is because of this parasite. These parasites were, having some serious cases because, again, the human immune system is really not responsive to it. It really has a severe effect in humans compared to animals. And so to avoid that issue, meat inspection laws came out because it's very visible. It's macroscopic when the adult larva is in meat. So when you are, making those meat cuts in the production facilities, they show up as white nodules, essentially. And you could cut it out. And if you cook it, it essentially kills it. And hopefully you're not eating white nodules on your meat. And I guess back in the day, that was an issue. So at this point in time, there's a really low infection rate in humans unless you're eating wild or game meat that don't have meat inspection laws. So there's not a huge concern unless you're a hunter. And moving on, next up, we have a dog hookworm. Next up is Ancylostoma caninum. So this is a nematode, so it's a two-part life cycle, and it can cause serious anemia, especially in puppies. This one was really interesting to learn about as well because it can infect humans, but it's not a serious infection. So it can cause something called cutaneous larva migrans, which is essentially creeping eruptions or red tracks in the skin. So it's going to show up as kind of like a vein-looking red mark, and it's going to be really itchy. But the good news is they can't really move any further than the cutaneous larva migrans in humans. It only affects animals in any sort of serious way. So the reason that this is a really sneaky parasite is because it has a variety of transmission routes. So puppies can get it through the placenta transplacentally. It's a little bit rarer, but it can happen. More commonly, they're infected through the mother's milk, so transmammary infection. And then there's also skin penetration, where an L3 stage larva can penetrate the skin, whether on a human or an animal, in the soil just from walking on contaminated ground, or in eating infected species. The reason that it's so prevalent in puppies and why it's much more serious in puppies is, again, because they don't have the developed immune response. So let's say that it's transmitted transplacentally, you're born with it, the puppy doesn't have the immune system to fight it off, so it progresses very seriously to an adult and molts very quickly, and they just can't fight it. So it can cause way more serious clinical symptoms than you might not have even noticed it in the mother. So the signs are pale gums. They're going to have a white or at least very pale pink oral mucosae. So that's, one of the reasons why when you go to the vet lifts up the dog's gums, checks the gums. It can be an indicator of anemia, whether it's by a parasite or any other. And also it's going to have dark diarrhea, and it could even collapse or die because of that anemia. And the diagnosis is the same as pretty much any other parasite we're going to talk about, and it's a fecal exam. But also it's important to look at blood work and make sure to check for anemia. And again, any veterinarian should be somewhat trained in hookworms since they're so common. They should be able to diagnose them on a routine fecal. So if you've ever had your vet give you one of those little blue sticks and say, go take a fecal at home and bring it back to me, that might be one of the things that they're checking for. If they suspected hookworm, or if it's just a routine test to make sure everything's okay, then that might be something that they're looking out for, especially if you live in the country. So we're going to talk about another puppy parasite, and it's called Toxocara canis. And these two are very similar, but the big takeaway is hookworms are aggressive in newborns, and they can kill quickly if untreated because of the transplacental or transmammary transmission. Also, as far as treating all of the parasites in this episode, they can all be treated by administering praziquantel, which is very interesting because there's certain parasites like the barber pole worm, which have almost become completely resistant to it. But all of these, it still works very effectively. And even though there's not a ton of preventatives other than heartworm, you can treat it pretty easily just by administering a drug. So I'll hand it off to Gretel to talk about Toxocara canis and cati.
So for Toxocara canis and cati, like we said, this is also known as roundworms. Classic roundworms of dogs and cats. These don't suck blood, but they do steal nutrients and cause GI issues like vomiting and bloating. If you've ever seen a puppy with a pot belly, that's generally the first indicator, and that this is very, very different. It's not a fat puppy. Something is going wrong. Normally it looks like a swollen or a distended belly, and a normal puppy's belly would be more rounded and proportional to its body. So the transmission of this is very fascinating. For the canis one, it can be passed from the mother across the placenta, through milk, or by eating eggs. And then for the cati, typically it spreads through milk or hunting rodents. Also, this can affect people, especially kids. So this can cause visceral larval migrans, VLM, which are larvae that migrate through your internal organs. There's also ocular larval migrans, OLM, and they travel to the eye and can cause vision loss. So how does this happen to humans, right? We take our dog to the vet, we take our cat to the vet, we normally get fecals, but in humans we don't normally have this year to year like our pets do. So humans can get this by swallowing eggs, normally from contaminated soil, and it's not through the skin. So think if you're outside gardening or you touch dirt and you don't wash your hands, unhygienic practices, you can actually get worms. So for example, hookworms, A. caninum, causes anemia, diagnosed via blood work and fecals. This is different than our T. canis. And then there's roundworms, Toxocara. This causes potbelly-like symptoms, vomiting, and round, big eggs show up easily on fecals. So deworm your pets, please, and wash your hands after going outside. This is the best means of prevention. Please do not get worms.
This is something we talked about in class, where there was a case study that we did where a child had been essentially playing in the cat's litter box as a sandbox. And yeah, I don't know if it had ingested the feces or maybe it was just gross. Anyway, that is a potential transmission. So it's important to keep your cat's litter away from the kids because they do vector a good bit of parasites. Whether it affects the animal or not, it can transmit to humans. Not all of them, but some. And then it can be serious. Like Gretel mentioned, it can cause visceral larva migrans, which is very serious. It can go to your heart, liver, lungs, anything. Once it gets through the skin, it can go anywhere. And it can just attack wherever that is. Your immune system responds. It causes anemia, all of that stuff. And the ocular larva migrans is kind of terrifying. If you look at pictures of it, and if you pull down the eyelid, you can literally see the worm coming like kind of right under the covering of the eye. It's very weird. So if you want to avoid that, maybe don't play in your cat's litter. Make sure to wash your hands. And same thing goes for outdoor sandboxes. If there's stray cats in the neighborhood, and then they're especially not being dewormed, that's a big route of transmission as well to children. That's why it's more prevalent in children, because of the transmission and because of the essentially playing in the dirt. And most adults don't do that unless you got a job that you've got to do that for, I guess. But next up, we're going to talk about one of the biggest parasites that, anybody in vet med, or if you just have a pet, is aware of. So this is Dirofilaria immitis, which is known as heartworm. It's every dog owner's nightmare. You've seen the pictures at the vet. They've got the posters on the wall. There's all these strings coming out of your dog's heart once you do a necropsy, and you can see that. It's really scary, and there's a reason that preventatives are pushed so hard at the veterinarian. Also, I thought it was interesting in doing the research for this episode, I learned that heartworm preventatives, I think stuff like NexGard or anything like that, also prevents a lot of these other parasites from infecting. It's not a surefire way. They don't advertise it because they don't want to say 99% infection. It's designed for heartworms, but at the end of the day, it could also prevent other worms as well. So these are long string-like worms that live in the heart and lungs of dogs. And if you haven't seen it, look it up. It's very crazy. I took one of my friends into the specimen room at necropsy, and they saw a dog heartworm case, and they are not in vet med, and they were a little freaked out. It's very alien looking. It's kind of like, that's not natural, right? So they essentially can get so obstructive that they shut off blood flow in the heart and cuts off oxygen in the brain. They go brain dead and they die. It's a very serious parasite because it's in the heart and the lungs, which is equally as critical. So it can also infect cats, and it's spread by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, what I learned in this class is that they vector so many parasites. I'm sure you've heard of Lyme disease, all of this stuff, but literally I would say maybe 25 to 30% of the parasites we learned were vectored by mosquitoes, which was shocking. I did not know that. And it's really scary. This class kind of changed the way that I view the world. I'm like making sure my meat's all the way cooked through, go outside at night, and I'm like, ooh, I should be wearing bug spray. I don't want to get bit by mosquitoes. So mosquitoes pick up something called microfilariae, which is a filarial form of larva. It just means larva. It's a fancy word to say larva. It's a different life cycle, but it's the same idea. So they take a blood meal from an infected dog, and then the larvae kind of grow through the intestines, or not the intestines, but the gut in the body of the mosquito. And then when the mosquito bites the next dog, they inject those larvae. For example, with malaria, they would inject something called sporozoites into the human, and that's what would infect. That's what the larvae are called. So every parasite might have a slightly different name for the larva, but they're all the same function. They're all just immature stages of the adult. You might not notice the symptoms at first, but over time, as it continues to obstruct the heart or lungs or wherever it's infected, it can cause coughing, exercise intolerance. So, same as if you're a human, you go to work out, you haven't worked out in a long time, you're out of breath, you're kind of just having a hard time. If you're taking your dog on a walk or on a run and they're having a hard time, these are all little symptoms that you might not be concerned. You might not take them to the vet right away, but then, it progresses and then it causes heart failure, and then everything's very quick from there. Again, this is one of the main reasons that preventatives and heartworm preventatives in specific are so important. So important. Flea, tick, heartworms, all of it is pushed heavy at the vet for a reason. They're not just trying to take your money. Now, human risk is very low, but people can develop lung nodules that look like tumors, but it's rare. So if you are experiencing, I don't know if it might cause lung pain or what the symptom would be, but you go in, you get an x-ray or an MRI, it might show up as a tumor. Your doctor might say, oh my goodness, you have a tumor. And then they go and do the biopsy, it was actually a worm. Anyway, diagnosis is a blood test. So unlike the other parasites that we talked about in this episode, this one infects the blood and the circulatory system and not the intestines. So you test the blood for antigens and you might do a microfilaria test. And I would have to do some more research on that, but I think you're essentially looking for the larva in the blood if it's infected the entire circulatory system as opposed to just the heart. So prevention is simple and it works. So monthly heartworm preventatives are way cheaper and safer than treatment.
Definitely. I've seen dogs lose a ton of weight, and actually your dog can still have this even if you got them and then you started giving them the treatment, because they can get it before. So before you give them any treatment at all, get them checked, get them a blood test so you know, because you could be putting off getting your dog treatment because you've been giving the preventative. So both things have to go hand in hand. And they just look completely miserable when dogs have heartworm. I've often found a lot of the times this happens with stray dogs because they're not regularly getting preventative, and it's just something to look out for. If you pick up a dog on the side of the road, say you want to adopt it, they might be at a greater risk for heartworm. On to our last segment. This is Parascaris equorum, the foal roundworm. So these worms affect young horses, especially under 6 months of age. These are picked up while grazing on a contaminated pasture. So hygienic practices in horse management is very, very important. Like if you're spreading manure on your pasture, do it on a separate one per season of where your horses are grazing, just so you're not at a greater risk. So what are signs of this? This could be coughing from the larval migration, stunted growth, dull coat, pot belly, and also a lot of heavy infections. And sometimes the intestines can even rupture after deworming. Yep, rupture. So sometimes it can happen that deworming can actually be dangerous for horses, because when you're giving a dewormer, it causes the worms to die and then they collect in the intestines. So while this sounds great, it can cause massive blockages, and it also can cause an incredible amount of inflammation in the body. So this is why regularly giving deworm at every stage of life in a horse is incredibly important because of the buildup. And you should also use the veterinary recommended dewormer for the time of year. And your horse, if you are grazing them on shorter grass, they're actually at a greater risk of picking up more worms than they would on tall grass. So any overgrazed lot, you really have to be careful with amount of worms. So how can we figure this out? Fecal egg count and clinical observation if something seems wrong with your foal. And prevention, like I said, age appropriate, regular, veterinary recommended deworming, and smart hygienic practices in husbandry.
Yeah, so one thing that you notice when we talk about all of, at least these parasites, this doesn't apply to the entire parasite world, of course, but most of these are managerial pet owner management strategies to prevent these parasites. Other than heartworm, which is pretty much only prevented by a drug, all of the rest of them are hygiene issues, or, just kind of avoiding zoonotic stages, like the litter box or the sandbox, or, the horses, making sure that they're not eating on overgrazed pasture, making sure that you're rotating pastures, things like that. These are all human choices that can affect the transmission of parasites to your animal. I thought that was something interesting. A lot of it's management, not necessarily a drug. While all of them are easily treatable, you have to notice the symptoms a little bit early. If something is wrong with your animal, if you see, they're coughing, they're this, they're that, a Parascaris equorum can infect the lungs, and they'll start coughing and they'll show serious symptoms in the lungs, as well as that intestinal blockage where it literally ruptures. And then it might look like they're colicking or like they're agitated, and it's at that point, it's kind of too late. But one fun thing that I wanted to add at the end of this, I know that we have done kind of like quick fire questions, right? This is something a little bit different that I'm going to test Gretel, since I did my studying, I put in the hours this semester. I kind of want to I don't consider myself an expert, but I do consider myself a little bit more than what I knew before, right? And I wanted to test Gretel and do a quick little pop quiz on truth or tapeworm. So before we go away, we're going to play a quick round. I'm going to share a parasite fact, and then Gretel will guess if it's true or if it's a worm. So, number 1. You can get a tapeworm from eating raw cookie dough. True or false?
Just so you all know, I had no idea about this. Completely unplanned.
It wasn't.
True or false? From raw cookie dough? Well, I feel like this more so goes with meat and not necessarily eggs. So I'm going to say false.
Correct. That's false. So you're more likely to get salmonella. That's the common thing that you think of when you're thinking about raw cookie dough with the eggs, like you said, chickens, anything like that. You're more likely to get salmonella. Tapeworms come from undercooked meat, not cookie dough. So that was right. And number 2, some parasites can change their host's behavior. So we're not talking about the virus strategy where they change the cell. We're talking about the animal's behavior.
I'm going to say true, because if their system is inflamed or if they're irritated or if they feel ill, that is a change in behavior.
Yeah, that is definitely one way to look at it. I know at the end of the semester we had our graduate, because it was a graduate class, but if you were not a graduate student, you didn't have to do the project, so yay me. But the graduate students had to essentially, they were assigned a parasite, and they had to talk about a specific example of how it affects the host's behavior. So Dirocelium dendriticum, I think, was the name of one of them, and it infects ants, and then a ruminant will come by and eat the ant. So it's so interesting how they alter the host behavior to go to the next stage of infection. So in this specific example, the ants climb to the top of the grass where they don't usually stay, and they hook on, and they go into a state of tetany, where their jaws just lock. They can't get off this piece of grass because these larvae have infected their brain, and it just shoots their nervous system. I don't understand why they go to the top. Like, it's just such an interesting topic. Anyway, that makes them much, much more susceptible to be eaten by a ruminant that's grazing on that grass, or a horse, or whatever it might be. And there was another one where there was multiple examples of trematodes where the second intermediate host was a fish, and those fish exhibited symptoms like flashing, where they're essentially flipping onto their side very quickly and it makes a flash. Birds come down, swoop, and eat them. Or they're shimmying or jerking or just really attracting birds to come eat them. Or just in general, all of the ones that we talked about caused them to stay towards the top of the water where they're more visible to birds. And one of them is because it infected the eyes. They can't really see, and they have to go to the lighter waters so that they can see their prey and eat. But it was just all very interesting. So yes, it is true that it can affect a host's behavior in both the way that I talked about, where it's kind of almost inexplicable, and like Gretel said, where they're literally just in pain and they're acting differently. So number 3.
While Michaelin hunts down another question to ask me, if you guys want to have an episode or having one on parasites, if you want us to look into conservation results of all this deworming, please let us know, or a wildlife version. So what would you treat in wildlife and what would you leave in wildlife? Because some of these can be very, very important for their livelihood. So please let us know.
And finally, number 3 that I finally kind of came up with looking back through our notes. So true or false, only outdoor cats need parasite prevention?
Absolutely false.
Yeah, exactly right. So I've seen a lot of Facebook discourse and like some of like the vet tech kind of groups where they're like, your inside cat still needs flea and tick preventatives. I don't care if it's inside, outside, whatever. You can bring it in on your shoes, all of that. Same thing applies to parasites. So completely false. Indoor cats can still get parasites. Like we said, even in the litter box example, the kid got it from the litter box. Where did the cat get it? It's obviously an indoor cat. We don't really know. Fleas can hitch a ride inside, and it can be in contaminated potting soil if you have plants in your house, or just a rogue housefly. There's no free passes just because they live on the couch. Everything, again, preventative is such a big deal. Whether they're indoor, outdoor, it doesn't matter. You might not be taking your cats on walks like you do your dogs, but these cats are still susceptible to infections from fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, everything. If it can get in your house and bite you and get on you, it can get your cat. So on that note, I think we've finished for the day. I hope y'all got a wonderful dose of your parasitology lessons for your future vet school class. I know that it's definitely changed the way that I view, again, like I said, everything, but it's more just a joke. It's just, you genuinely see it every day, like how many routes of transmission there are. And this applies to everything, but I was just very hyper-focused on parasitology these past few months, so we wanted to do an episode on it. I think it's interesting, but yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and please let me know if you want to hear about anything else. There are so many versatile, adaptable, and incredibly creepy and crazy parasites. So thank you for listening.
Be sure to subscribe, share this episode with your vet med friends, and if you have questions, like Gretel said, there's a submission on the end of our website page, and you can submit anything you want to talk about. If you want to suggest a topic or anything like that, our website is thevetfilespod.com, and we'd love to hear your ideas and suggestions. Until next time, this is the Vet Files signing off.